Hey, so today I'm going to be responding to something that you've probably seen a lot of if you use either Discord or Telegram, which unfortunately I do. There are multiple versions, but these are some of the first results if you Google Jewish slave meme. Several claims are made. One, very few, that is, less than half a percent of whites owned slaves. Two, Jews owned a lot of slaves relative to whites who made up the vast majority of slave owners. Also, some other memes, of which I'll show one example, claim that most slave traders were Jewish. In this video, I will demonstrate that all of these claims are wrong. So, anyway, the first claim is that very few whites owned slaves. This is simply not true. Robert Fogel wrote in his Without Consent contract that in 1830, 36% of white Southern households owned slaves, and in 1860, 25% did. Another researcher writes that, in accordance with the customary emphasis, historians often include all the slave states in their statistical presentations. If one is interested in the deterministic impact of slavery, however, it would appear more appropriate to consider only the Confederate states, where fully 31% of the white families owned slaves in 1860. Thus, every third white person in those states had a direct commitment to slavery, and barring occasional dissidents, had cause to be a supporter and a propagandist for the system. This appears to be an amazingly large rather than small base of support for any economic order, and the figures are more impressive when we consider the 7 states of the Lower South and the precise order of their secession from the Union. South Carolina with 48.7% of the white families owning slaves, Mississippi with 48%, Florida with 36%, Alabama with 35.1%, Georgia with 38%, Louisiana with 32.2%, and Texas with 28.5%. They claim that less than half of a percent of whites owned slaves is simply ridiculous. In 1998, Eli Faber published his book Jews, Slaves, and the Slave Trade, which is by far the most thorough analysis of the topic. Most of his book focuses on slavery in Barbados and Jamaica, but he also includes data for America, which I will go over last. Here are a couple excerpts from his book on slave ownership in Barbados. Of the 404 white households in Bridgetown in 1680, 54, 13.3% were Jewish. They owned 163 of the town's 1439 slaves, or 11.3%, a figure slightly below their proportion among the town's families. Bridgetown's 350 non-Jewish families, or 86.6% of its households, owned 1276 of its slaves, or 88.6%, placing their proportion of the slaves they owned slightly above their proportion among the town's families. Jewish slave-owning households numbering 49 owned an average of 3.3 slaves, while non-Jewish families owning slaves, totaling 318, owned an average of 4.0. Finally, Bridgetown's Jewish families were no more likely to own slaves than those who were not Jewish. Of its 250 non-Jewish households, 318 or 90.8% possessed slaves. Of the 54 Jewish households, 49 or 90.7% did. In St. Peter's Parish, the average and the proportional differences between non-Jewish and Jewish households are even greater, owing to the fact that the census there combined the results for the parish's town, Spadestown, with those for its plantations. Of the parish's 246 households, 14 or 5.6% were Jewish, but they had 49 or 1.6% of its 3017 slaves. Conversely, St. Peter's 232 non-Jewish slave-owning families, or 94.3% of the total number of households, owned 2968 or 98.3% of all slaves. The parish's non-Jewish slave-owning families, a total of 189, owned an average of 15.7 slaves each, while its 14 Jewish households averaged 3.5. According to the criteria of proportionality and averages, therefore, Jews in St. Peter's Parish were less apparent as slave owners than were its non-Jewish inhabitants. On the other hand, the parish's Jewish households were more likely to hold slaves. Each of the 14 Jewish families, or 100%, did, while among the parish's 232 non-Jewish households, 189, or 81.4%, owned slaves. Here's a table from Faber's book showing the ownership of slaves among Jews and non-Jews in Port Royal, which is in Jamaica, in 1740. It shows that almost 90% of slaves were owned by non-Jews and less than 10% were owned by Jews, which is almost exactly what their proportion of the population was. The Jewish and non-Jewish populations can be calculated by adding up the non-Jews who were slave owners and who were not slave owners, which is 259, and adding up the 29 Jews who owned or did not own slaves. In total, there were 288 people, of whom 29 were Jewish, which means that just over 10% were Jewish. Also, 53% of Gentiles owned slaves compared to 52% of Jews, which is almost exactly the same number. Another table shows that basically the same proportion of slaves were owned by Jews in 1772 in another part of Jamaica as in Kingston. 10.7% of slaves were owned by Jews, and the Jews were 18% of the population, meaning that they were somewhat underrepresented. Also, 61% of Jews owned slaves compared to 83% of Gentiles. Obviously, I cannot show every single sentence or every single table in the book which tries to quantify Jewish ownership of slaves, but if you believe that I'm somehow cherry picking data, you should just read the book for yourself. Anyway, Faber also provides some data for America. He writes that, quote, Philadelphia's inhabitants owned 1,118 slaves in 1769 according to its proprietary tax list for that year. Entries for non-Jewish individuals who owned slaves were 618 in number, with a total of 1,106 slaves, or 98.9% of all slaves, each entry averaging 1.7 slaves each. Entries for individuals whose religion is uncertain were 3 in number, with 4 slaves, an average of 1.3 slaves each. The remaining 6 entries were for Jewish residents of Philadelphia, with 8 slaves among them, or 0.7% of all slaves. They averaged somewhat less than Philadelphia's non-Jewish residents at 1.3 slaves each. So it can clearly be seen from the best book on the topic that Jews were not overrepresented among slave owners, but there is one author who is sometimes cited by people who do believe in massive Jewish involvement. The author is Bertram Korn, who wrote a book in 1961 titled Jews and Negro Slavery in the Old South, 1789 to 1865. He provides a couple estimates of Jewish involvement. In South Carolina, in 1790, just under 51 slaves were owned by Jews. Of 73 Jewish families, 34 owned slaves, which is 47%. Next, he cites data from one county in Georgia in 1850, which finds that 90 slaves were owned by Jews. 72 Jewish families were in the county, and 31 of those owned slaves. This means that 43% were slave owners. Lastly, Korn gives data that is actually comparable, and from the entire country as a whole. He writes, quote, another statistical indication of Jewish ownership of slaves, probably more accurate in terms of proportions than the census returns, are references to slaves in Jewish wills. There are 129 wills of identifiable Southern Jews who died during the period of our interest. Of these, 33 refer to the ownership and disposition of slaves. This would imply, if it is a reliable index, that perhaps 1/4 of Southern Jewish adults were slave owners. It is instructed that this matches the federal figures for the 1860 census, namely that 3/4 of the white population of the South were not slave owners. He goes on to say that the Jews were more likely to live in cities where slavery was less common, and that this could mean that they were still overrepresented among slave owners in cities. But even if that were true, this would still mean that Jews were not overrepresented as a whole, which is what is claimed. Also, Faber's data for Philadelphia found that Jews were still not overrepresented relative to other people living in the same city. In Faber's book, there's also data for Jewish representation in the slave trade. In early 18th century Barbados, only a handful of almost 1,500 slave ships were owned or co-owned by Jews. I calculated the actual percentage owned by Jews, and it was 0.9%. If you include those co-owned by Jews, the figure is 1.7%. Faber also has pretty good data for 18th century Jamaica. From 1742 to 1769 in Jamaica, the percentage of slaves owned by Jews ranged from 1% to just over 9%. Now here's the data for the U.S. Faber writes, surviving naval office records for New York for most of the period between June 24, 1750 and June 24, 1743 document the arrival of 4,049 slaves, while another 314 appear in fragmentary records for March 25, 1748 through January 5, 1765. Of the total of 4,363 slaves, Jewish ship owners participated in the delivery of 377, or 8.6%. Of the latter, 345, or 7.9% of the grand total, arrived in vessels owned by partnerships of Jews and non-Jews. 30, or less than 1%, 0.7% to be exact, arrived in vessels owned exclusively by Jewish individuals. The remaining 3,986 slaves, or 91.3%, were imported on vessels owned entirely by non-Jews. Later, Faber writes again that the number of slaves known to have been transported from the coast of Africa by Rhode Island slave vessels between 1753 and 1774 was 16,043 in 145 of the 347 voyages conducted during these years. Of the 145 vessels, 135, or 93.1%, were owned by non-Jews. They carried 14,643 slaves, or 91.2% of the entire 16,043. The remaining 10 vessels, or 6.8%, belonged to Newport's Jewish merchants, and they conveyed 1,400, or 8.7%. Hence, insofar as one can judge, during the years in which they participated in the slave trade, Newport's Jewish merchants were involved in fewer than 10% of Rhode Island's voyages to Africa and fewer than 10% of slaves the colony businessmen carried away from Africa. Over the entire course of their colonies' involvement in the African slave trade, they were responsible for a still smaller percentage of slaves, for they did not participate in the slave trade prior to 1753. Projected forward to 1807, when the United States abolished the slave trade with Africa, the percentage falls even further, for among the 421 known Rhode Island voyages to Africa between 1784 and 1807, only 7 were mounted by Jewish merchants, in every case in partnership with non-Jewish merchants. 7 divided by 421 is 1.7%, so Jews were only responsible for 1.7% of the voyages between 1784 and 1807. So given this evidence, it seems that in Barbados, Jamaica, and the United States, Jews were responsible for a small portion of the slave trade, probably around 5%, even though in some places at some times it was almost 10%. Furthermore, there is also data on investments into the slave trade. The East India Company would be the organization in charge of transporting slaves to the Americas by England, and Jews were the owners of 12% of its stock. Relative to their ownership of other stocks, they were overrepresented in the East India Company stocks, but they definitely were not the primary funders of slavery, at least in England. Next, I will provide several quotes from a paper published by Drescher in 1993, which provides a more qualitative account. He writes, 2 of the largest slaving partners, England and France, were responsible for shipping at least 40% of the total number of African slaves to the New World. In these 2 cases, Jewish participation was so insignificant that historians of the slave trade no more than occasionally cite a few Jewish individuals or families in French or English seaports who engage in slaving activities. These were rare instances among the hundreds of Catholic and Protestant investors who dominated all trades of England and France, including the African. Were one to include in such an accounting additional thousands of Europeans and Africans who commanded or manned the slave ships, or the Afro-Europeans and Africans who participated in the trade in the African supply side, the relative significance of the Jewish role in these enterprises would diminish even further. Since the mid-17th century was the period in which the Dutch controlled a substantial portion of the Atlantic slave trade, the Jewish role in the Atlantic slave trade could, therefore, have been both substantial and important for a generation after 1640 via the Dutch trade. It turns out, however, that Jews played a minimal and subordinated role, both managerially and financially, among the major Dutch slavers. They did not serve on the Heeren X, the directorate of the Dutch West India Company. Their investment share amounted to only 0.5% or 1 200ths of the company's capital. What then was the overall role of the Jews in organizing and financing the transatlantic slave trade? The 4 most substantial trades, the British and French trades of the late 17th and 18th centuries, and Brazilian and Cuban slave trades of the 18th and 19th centuries, accounted for almost 90% of the forced African migration. In those 4 great trades, the Jewish role ranged from marginal to virtually nil. In the minor Danish and minuscule Brandenburg, Swedish, and Courland slave trades, Jews did play significant entrepreneurial or organizational roles, but even were we to absurdly assign all Africans transported under the flags of Denmark, Sweden, Brandenburg, etc., to a Jewish account, all of those Baltic traders combined did not account for as much as 0.7% of Europe's slave trade. Ах, эти черные глаза, кто вас полюбит? So the conclusion, I guess, is that Jews were not really overrepresented among those who owned slaves, at least not in British colonies during the 18th and 19th centuries. And they also may have been overrepresented among, for example, like those purchasing East India Company stocks, and they might have been overrepresented among those who owned slave ships to some extent also, although I don't even know if that is true, right? Because even though I said earlier that it's around 5%, that's only for dates where there is good data on it, right? And presumably for dates where there isn't much data, they were actually less overrepresented, right? Or probably even underrepresented. And for example, like in Jamaica, there was one time period where they made up 1%, then another where they made up 5%, another where they made up a little over 9%. I think it was 9.2%. And but like that's not counting every single year that there was slavery in Jamaica. And then Rhode Island specifically, Eli Faber, he wrote that they weren't like for near the end of the American slave trade with Africa, they basically made up nothing, right? Like 1.7%, just 7 out of 421 voyages. And there's also the question, of course, where you have to consider whether Gentile-Jewish partnerships matter. Like, what does that count for? And I guess you could count like every single individual Jew versus every single Gentile that was running the ships, right? So like if there were two Gentiles in charge and one Jew in charge, that would be one extra tick for the Jewish category and two extra ticks for the Gentile category. But you just can't do that with this data, and I'm not gonna go through all of it. Uh, but the fact that Jews and Gentiles seem to collaborate at least somewhat often, right? Not that much less often than Jews in general were able to go in these enterprises, probably suggests that there wasn't a big religious reason for it, for Jewish participation. Which I didn't show memes like this, but I've seen some where it says, like, for example, that slave auctions were held on Jewish holidays. So I think that this data would go against that notion. Outside from just the reductio ad absurdum, right? It's just kind of absurd to say that Jews were participating in this as a religious thing, right? Because, well, not only because it assumes that they were participating in a exorbitant rate, right? Which is, false, but also because it's just kind of retarded, right? And I'm sure you could find like stuff from the Talmud where it says like that it says that Gentiles are cattle or whatever, but I don't think that that's driving a lot of Jewish business decisions. And of course, you could apply the fact that these memes can be pretty easily proven wrong and don't really have much basis to them. You can apply this to other things, right? Like you see like 4chan green text. It does not mean that it's true. And to some extent, journalism is just a bunch of memes, right? Like it's like a science article and you see the headline and it's like new study claims and it's something completely retarded. That doesn't mean that you have to like artistically analyze everything and fact check it or whatever. Personally, for most things, I just if I think that it's retarded or rather that it sounds retarded, I just assume it's fake and then like I put it on my reading list to eventually prove it wrong or maybe get convinced. But so far, my instincts have usually been correct. And I think this is generally just the way you should do it. And if you don't want to research it, just assume it's wrong, right? Like if something doesn't match up with whatever you believe, just assume it's wrong unless it's not completely retarded. Because you can usually tell by the way that things are formulated whether or not they're going to be stupid. Or rather, stupid wouldn't be the right term here. It would just be veracity, right? Just is it right or is it wrong? Because things can be wrong in a smart way to some extent, and that you'll also have to kind of be wary of, but that's less dangerous. Uh, anyway, I guess that's it for this video. Jews are not overrepresented were not overrepresented among people who owned slaves or people who transported slaves, and although they probably were overrepresented among those who funded slavery, they still didn't make up the vast majority of it, so slavery probably would have been pretty much exactly the same if Jews weren't here, right? They didn't really contribute much to it.